Over the course of the last few years, we've seen sports grow into a huge branch of the entertainment industry. This has come to the point where pretty much every single one of those top live broadcasting events are sporting events. And a huge part of that sports market is college sports. We've seen a few conferences like the Big Ten, Pac-12, and SEC even create their own networks for themselves, and big-time schools like Notre Dame move forward with their own broadcast agreements on channels like NBC. But one school created a network for themselves in 2011 that both saved and ended up handicapping the conference that school was in, and of course, I'm talking about the University of Texas and their Longhorn Network. It was such a unique and weird broadcast channel, specifically for all things Longhorns, and had such an interesting page in the history book of college sports before it was inevitably dissolved into the ESPN streaming services when Texas joined the SEC. But what the heck was on it? Why did the Longhorn Network exist? And why is it so important in the history of the Big 12 and now the SEC Conference? In today's video, I'm going to try to answer all these questions, and I'm also going to make the bold statement that it was one of the most worthless networks ever created and really served no need and didn't have any point. But before we get started, if you're a big fan of college football, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like if you support today's video, and let me know what player, team, topic, or situation I can cover next. Now let's get started and talk about the Longhorn Network. Let's first start with what the Longhorn Network was and what types of programming it had. It was a joint television and broadcast channel managed by both the Texas Athletic Department and ESPN that had programming 24 hours a day. Types of things that you could see on the network included broadcast of Longhorns games that weren't carried by any other major provider, meaning that you sometimes got basketball games or Olympic sports on there. You also got original series on the Longhorns and their history, throwback broadcasts of games in Texas history, and other things related to the University of Texas, like the occasional student broadcast or academic event, or even heck, a lecture. The landmark 1984 court case in the NCAA versus Oklahoma allowed colleges and their conferences to bargain for their own broadcast deals, which was most of the time football and men's basketball games. The idea to get coverage for things that didn't typically get covered was one that Texas had in their minds, even as far back as before the Longhorns even joined the Big 12. Then athletic director DeLoss Dodds said, quote, "Football was getting coverage, basketball was getting coverage, and other sports weren't." The network was created in 2011 and built on a 20-year deal that would have been worth over $300 million. The Big Ten had been the first to create their own network in 2006, and talks to create a Big 12 network had fallen through around the same time, largely due to Texas's unwillingness to join one. But the concept of a channel specifically for one school was still pretty new. Then Texas President William Powers said, quote, "This is an extremely exciting new venture for our university. With our partners, we are now able to increase the exposure of our outstanding athletics programs and our first-class academic and cultural communities. This agreement provides new significant resources to enhance the faculty and academic support." After a short while, the Longhorn Network actually started to get a lot of carriage as more and more alumni in the state of Texas and around the country wanted to watch the network. By 2012, it extended carriage through Cox Communications into neighboring states like Oklahoma, Louisiana, and even Arkansas. And in 2013, it started to get carried as a normal television station by Time Warner Cable. By 2014, it went through satellite on both Dish Network and DirecTV, meaning that more people got to see Longhorn Network. This created multiple problems for other schools while Texas reaped the benefit. For one, many Big 12 schools in particular found that smaller athletic events against the Longhorns would end up on Longhorn Network if they weren't already on bigger things like ESPN or ESPN2, and this meant they'd have to watch games that were called by commentators that the University of Texas selected and featured advertisements that were solely for the University of Texas. This made it feel incredibly biased and difficult to watch for fans. It also may have been the final nail in the coffin for Texas A&M into leaving the Big 12 Conference before it even went on air. Before its creation, Texas reportedly reached out to Texas A&M and asked if they wanted to share the network, only to launch it on their own before A&M could really do anything about it. Former Texas A&M president R. Bowen Lofton said, quote, "There was a discussion about that, but it never got legs. I never got the sense that we could cut a deal that would make sense for Texas A&M to be somehow connected to their network. Instead of working on finding a solution that could work for both schools, Texas would greenlight the project on their own." Texas A&M immediately was threatened, as were the other schools in the state of Texas, because the network almost instantly gave Texas a recruiting leg up on pretty much everyone else in the state. The primary reason for this was due to the fact that Texas had planned on airing 18 high school football games per season on its own network, and that meant recruits who were being recruited by Texas A&M, Baylor, or Texas Tech or TCU would be met with branding for the Longhorns over anyone else. And the Texas coaches would immediately get more scouting time of those players without even having to ask for film or attend the games themselves. Longhorn Network Vice President Dave Brown said, quote, I can't wait to see recruiting target Jonathan Gray. The feedback we got for our audience is they want to see Jonathan Gray run. Whether it's 45-0 or not, they want to see more Jonathan Gray. Eventually, the NCAA and Big 12 both decided it was an unfair advantage for Texas to air those high school games, and Texas was banned from doing so. But they still wanted to, and that was enough to make people upset. This soured Texas A&M on staying in the conference at Texas to the point where they'd already made up their minds on leaving. Texas was already a benefactor of unequal revenue sharing in the Big 12, meaning they made more money than just about everybody else from the Big 12's media deal. The Aggies were set on leaving, and it was only dependent on if the SEC would take them. The Ray D later said, quote, "We went from having a divided house to I'd say 95% of the Texas Aggies, current and former students, saying the same thing to me. Let's go to the SEC." By the time it was released, the Big 12 was already in trouble. Nebraska had grown upset because Texas now dominated the conference that was essentially Nebraska's. Nebraska's say was nowhere near as important as Texas, who'd only been in the conference for close to 15 years at that point. So they decided that they would leave for a conference where the grass was greener and wasn't being fed on burnt orange cattle. But it wasn't just Nebraska. Everybody knows the story of what almost became the Pac-16. Colorado left the Big 12 for the Pac-10 in early 2010, with the Pac-10 making inroads with Texas, Texas Tech, Oklahoma, and Oklahoma State to potentially join the Pac, as well as to create the first 16 super conference in the modern era. Texas A&M, Kansas, and Utah were also involved in negotiations. Every school had agreed to leave the Big 12 and join the Pac-10 except for one, Texas. A&M balked early when faced with the choice between the Pac-16 with Texas or the SEC without Texas, and chose to focus on the Southeast. Most of Texas's reluctance to join the mega conference was due to the fact that there would be some weird things done with the Longhorn Network. Former Pac-12 Commissioner Larry Scott was even on record saying that the Longhorn Network was definitely a sticking point, but one he didn't think was insurmountable. Whatever it was, Texas did, and the Longhorn Network was the main reason, amongst a few others, they decided to stick around. Them sticking around would convince Texas Tech, Oklahoma, and Oklahoma State to do the same, which would keep the conference together for another few years. It was also the sole deciding factor that got ESPN to agree to help broadcast the network themselves. But more anger would follow once it was determined that the Longhorn Network would air at least one exclusive football game per season, and later on, one exclusive Big 12 game. That meant that the only way Big 12 fans of other schools would be able to watch that game was if they had the Longhorn Network, a channel devoted solely to a school they personally didn't care or maybe couldn't stand, and had to pay the University of Texas to use. The channel continued to grow though, as by 2016 it was available in nearly 20 million television sets across the country, but with that demand for viewership, the Longhorn Network had to keep digging deeper on what their fans wanted to watch, and that meant getting more and more intrusive on their own sports teams. All-access cameras and film crews were at football practices, team meetings, and other sensitive things, which were broadcasted on television for all to see, including coaches of other teams. By the time it went off air, the Longhorn Network was running regularly with 11 programs. A weekly recap show called Longhorn Extra, Rewind or Game Plan, as that was with Steve Sarkisian as they went over the last game and prepared for the next one, Texas All Access, Game Day, and Game Day Final. Docuseries also included shows like Longhorn Legends, Texas Greatest Games, and Texas Greatest Athletes. Plus, they had a docuseries solely devoted to the 2005 National Championship season. Fans of other teams were also not very kind to the staffers of the Longhorn Network, and one staffer even said, quote, "There was a point where we were using duct tape to cover the Longhorn Network logo on our cameras and gear just because of how it was being perceived for being associated with the Longhorn Network." Stuck with just 10 teams after the original band of Realignment hit them, the Big 12 was constantly looking towards expansion. After adding TCU and West Virginia in 2012, the conference was also interested in adding Louisville for the 2013 season, but major boosters in the Texas sphere of influence were down on the idea. For one, they thought that Louisville's academics would hurt Texas's stance on major academic institutions, but another downside was that adding more schools would further dilute their earnings, even though they still had an entire television channel all to themselves. Texas's loud voice against expansion continued all the way throughout the 2020s, as then they decided to join the SEC to escape the mess that they had their hand in both saving and creating in the Big 12. But by 2024, Texas would eventually join the SEC alongside Oklahoma, and the SEC already had their own network, the SEC Network, and they weren't going to allow the Longhorn Network and the SEC Network to coexist. Texas's AD admitted that the Longhorn Network would cease its operations and merged most of its staff and other things entirely into ESPN Plus and the SEC Network. The final few things that the Longhorn Network would broadcast were a baseball game against Kansas, a documentary on the 2005 season, and a credit roll of everyone who had ever worked on the channel since its start, and this came before it shut down, coinciding with the broadcast of Texas's entry into the SEC with a parade and celebration. What used to be the Longhorn Network was now repurposed into a school channel that holds the rights to a lot of old programming, and still runs things like post-game interviews and press conferences. After hearing all this, I still agree with the title of today's video. I think this was the most worthless network of all time. It really didn't do that much for Texas, as it doesn't even exist anymore. It created a lot of problems in the Big 12, it made a lot of fans upset, and I haven't looked at the finances, but I wonder if it even really did that much for their bottom line. Ultimately, Texas's move to the SEC was much more beneficial than the Longhorn Network ever was, and it would have been kind of cool if the Big 12 got their own network, and maybe we would have seen schools like Texas A&M, Missouri, and even Nebraska stay, and it all just to me seems pretty dang worthless. I remember as a kid seeing Longhorn Network on TV, and I wondered why this thing existed, but it's Texas. They do things differently down there, and it's crazy that they had their own network for about a decade or so. But what do you guys think? If you're a Texas fan, what did you think of the Longhorn Network? If you're a fan of another school, what did you think of the Longhorn Network? And what is another worthless thing I could take a look at next? Be sure to let me know down below, leave a like if you want to support today's video, subscribe if you're new, and check out my other videos on the end screen. Hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.